Hey, Professor Lenz here, and the name of this talk is A Vision of Unity and Peace for America. And the point of this talk is to promote an alternative to all of the violence that we see in our politics in recent years. So you all are probably aware that in the last couple of years, political violence in America has reached alarming levels. For example, in 2021, we had the Capitol Hill riots. We had the attempted kidnapping of the Michigan governor, Gretchen Whitmer, back in 2021. Nancy Pelosi, who is one of the most powerful members of Congress, her home was broken into by an attacker. And she wasn't home, but her husband was, and he was nearly beat to death with a hammer. That was in 2022. Then, of course, there were two political assassination attempts on President Trump, and they were both in 2024. Then there was the political assassination of United Healthcare CEO, Brian Thompson. That was also in 2024. And then there was an attempted assassination on the Pennsylvania governor, Josh Shapiro, and his family's life in 2025, this past year, in an act of arson. And then there were the horrific shootings and assassination of a Minnesota lawmaker. Elon Musk's Tesla properties being set ablaze earlier this year. And the New Mexico Republican headquarters being torched to the ground through an act of arson. And of course, one of the most high-profile acts of political violence was the assassination of political commentator Charlie Kirk. An absolutely horrific event that took place at a college, which was particularly horrific and shocking at the same time. Now the question becomes, what are some of the key factors driving political violence in America? Well, political scientists have pointed to some of the following problems, and they are polarizing and dehumanizing rhetoric. Political leaders and media pundits often use inflammatory language that portrays opponents as enemies or evil, which can signal to supporters that violence may be acceptable. We've all been privy to this polarizing and dehumanizing rhetoric on both sides, sadly. A second factor leading to political violence in America is intense partisan identity. Many Americans have aligned multiple aspects of their identity, their race, their religion, their geography, with their political party. And this has led to a sense of existential threat when their party or identity is challenged. This us versus them dualistic dynamic increases the psychological readiness for conflict. Disinformation and conspiracy theories is the third cause for political violence. The spread of false narratives, such as claims of a stolen election back in 2020, through social media and other platforms, can inflame a sense of threat and victimhood, leading some individuals to believe violence is a necessary last resort to, quote, save the country. And of course, y'all, the idea that violence can be a tool to save the country is, of course, preposterous. right? Violence never leads to anywhere positive for the people or a nation. The fourth major cause of political violence, identified by political scientists, is the weakened state of American institutions. The decline of traditional party organizations and the increasing politicization of institutions like the courts and law enforcement weaken the guardrails against extremism and make violence more likely to be seen as a viable option. Right? So when we lose faith in the court system, or we lose faith in law enforcement, or we lose faith in Congress or the presidency, people are more likely to take matters into their own hands because they believe that the institutions aren't working the way they were intended to. And a fifth reason for political violence brought up by political scientists is a growing number of Americans perceive that violence is justified. So what we're seeing is an increasing and alarming percentage of Americans reflected in polls who believe that violence might be necessary against political elites to get the country, quote, back on track. And people are more likely to feel this, especially if they feel like their political goals cannot be achieved through peaceful means. And the next 4 causes for political violence are ones that are noted by political sociologists and psychologists. So far, to recap, for causes leading to political violence, polarizing and dehumanizing rhetoric, number 1, intense partisan identity, number 2, disinformation and conspiracy theories on social media, 3, the state of our weakened institutions, number 4, perceived justification for violence, number 5, and number 6, growing economic inequality. Ooh, this is a big one, right, y'all? The intensifying wealth gap between the rich and the poor in America is sowing the seeds of resentment among a growing proportion of the population against political elites who they perceive as not representing them. So the wealth gap is leading to increased anger at the system on both sides. And this is a failing in our own country that hasn't gotten the kind of attention that maybe it deserves. Outside, of course, people like Bernie Sanders, who captured the public spotlight with this message. But generally speaking, wealth inequality as a cause of political violence is not typically brought up as a precipitating factor, but it is. Number 7, mental health and aggression. Individual psychological factors such as aggressive personality traits, stress, and depression can make some people more susceptible to radicalization and more likely to commit political violence when exposed to a volatile political environment. So it's not surprising, y'all, that all of the acts of horrific violence that we've seen in our politics in recent years have been perpetrated by individuals who definitely could be perceived as having mental health issues. In some cases, serious mental health issues. In the recent killing of Charlie Kirk, the killer had a long history of mental health problems. In the case of the individual who assassinated the Minnesota lawmaker, he also had a long history of having mental health issues. So mental health combined with a volatile political climate will increase the likelihood for violence. Number 8, the breakdown of traditional family structures. Now, this may sound very controversial, but violence in politics tends to correspond, according to some sociologists, when the family unit is perceived as breaking apart or is breaking apart. Numerous criminology studies have established a causal link between children from single-family households and the propensity to commit acts of violence, including political violence. And by the way, if you're wondering, the percentage of U.S. children living in single-parent households has increased from 9% in 1960 to 25% in 2023. And by no means, y'all, am I suggesting that just because you grew up in a single-family household, that means you're going to become violent. No. There's plenty of examples of people who come from single-family households who are peaceful, loving, and law-abiding citizens. It just increases the likelihood of that happening. Finally, number 9, another cause of political violence is the loss of a sense of personal connection. Again, all of these acts of political violence we've seen have been perpetrated by individuals who, A, feel an intense, how do we say this? An intense hatred of the other side, and who also feel a sense of lacking personal connection. In other words, their lives are in disarray, and they've lost a sense of connection to themselves, to others, to major institutions in society. And so psychological polls carried out by the American Psychological Association have shown that 7 out of 10 American adults report feeling emotionally disconnected. And another 6 out of 10 report feeling in need of, quote, receiving more emotional support than they currently receive. So one can see how a disconnection combined with a radicalized, volatile political climate could lead to an increased chance of political violence. So, what are some solutions to this political violence? Well, you know, in my mind, there are 2 ways to address this political violence. One way is through finding peace within our society collectively. And the second way is through finding more peace within ourselves. So first, a little definition of peace. Peace is a state of tranquility, harmony, and freedom from conflict or violence, both on a large scale within our countries and communities, and on a personal scale in our mind and in our hearts. Peace can be defined as the absence of war and hostility, or as a more active state of mutual understanding, something that we're in desperate need of today. So again, as I mentioned, how do we arrive at peace? The problem of political violence must be addressed in both of the following ways. Through finding peace within ourselves, number 1, and 2, through finding peace collectively. Now, some impactful avenues to finding peace within ourselves include engaging in spiritual practices like prayer and meditation. And before you think I'm going a little bit out there and going way off on the reservation, hear this. If, as individuals, we each learn to find peace within ourselves, then we will be much less likely to act out aggressively in our communities. In other words, if we have peace within ourselves, we're not going to even think about carrying out acts of violence against, quote, the other side, In fact, if we find enough peace within ourselves, we may even learn not to identify with one side or the other as it relates to politics. We may transcend dualistic thinking altogether. So practices like prayer and meditation can help us find our center, can help us each become more peaceful people. Because all of the violence we see on the outside is really a reflection of the violence that we have within ourselves. The lack of centeredness, the lack of balance, the lack of peace. Another way to find peace within ourselves is through deepening our connection with nature. I think this is pretty obvious that we are highly disconnected from the natural world. And connecting with nature is a way to find inner peace within ourselves. Embracing the opportunities to serve in our own communities. Nothing will break down the barriers better than serving one another, finding a way to serve. Limiting our exposure to handheld technologies, and especially social media. In other words, guys, spending less time on our phones, right? That's a way to become more connected and more peaceful within ourselves. I would argue that we spend far too much time on social media, and this has the impact of agitating our minds and closing down our hearts. Now, some impactful avenues to finding peace on the outside in our nation include disengaging from dehumanizing and polarizing political rhetoric. It's a big one, guys. Do not dehumanize anyone from, quote, the other side. Being mindful of what media outlets we obtain our political news from, and making sure that we're not getting our news from extremist websites or outlets. Withdrawing our support from those politicians who promote extremist views and opinions. Stop supporting extremists on either side. We need to place a greater emphasis on civil discourse in our educational system. So I saw something really interesting on our own campus. Last year, a group of students were organizing huge forums where people gather from both sides to talk about controversial topics like Donald Trump's role in our democracy or abortion. So we need to create more spaces where partisans from both liberal and conservative can come and have peaceful debate and hear one another's different perspectives. A lot of the violence we're seeing today is the result of no longer being exposed to one another, of no longer engaging in peaceful debate with one another, right? When the conversations break down between sides, that's when violence ensues. We also have to place a greater emphasis on addressing the enormous wealth gap in America. That's a huge problem in this country. We need to address that wealth gap in America. So really what we need is we need to promote more peaceful dialogue. We need to go to less biased media sources that promote hateful rhetoric. We need to withdraw our support from those politicians who promote extremist views. And at the same time, we need to learn to find more inner peace within ourselves. And I'd like to leave you with this quote from the Dalai Lama. And the Dalai Lama is the supreme leader, spiritual leader of Tibet, who has been under siege by China for a very long time now. He said the following: "We can never find peace in the outer world until we make peace within ourselves." Very important point I want to leave you with. So maybe all of the political violence we're seeing is a result of our own lack of inner peace. I want to thank you all for listening today. I know this was a abridged review of the talk that I gave in person, but I wanted to give you all something. So much peace to everybody.